During the trial, my arrogant ex-husband leaned into his microphone and bragged, "I am taking every last penny she has." From the gallery, his new mistress laughed out loud, adjusting the diamond necklace around her neck. Unfazed, my attorney leaned toward me and quietly asked, "Is the trap ready?" I smiled and nodded. His ultimate legal nightmare was finally unfolding today, and he had no idea he was digging his own grave. My name is Jada, and at 34 years old, I never expected my divorce hearing to turn into a crime scene. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to watch a toxic person destroy their own life through sheer arrogance. The heavy oak doors of the Chicago family court were sealed shut, trapping me in a room with the man who had spent the last 5 years trying to break my spirit. Julian was 35 years old, a vice president at a prestigious investment fund, and a textbook narcissist. He sat on the witness stand wearing a custom-tailored suit, trying to charm the judge with his practiced smile. I sat next to my lawyer, Elias, keeping my face completely blank. My profession as a crisis public relations manager for high-profile clients had taught me how to mask my emotions. Today, I needed every ounce of that training. Julian adjusted his tie and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, my wife's public relations firm was built entirely on my back. I provided the initial seed money. I paid the lease for her office space. I introduced her to her first 10 clients. Without my financial backing and my network, she would still be organizing bake sales. Therefore, I am requesting 80% ownership of her business assets in this divorce settlement." I felt my jaw clench. Every word out of his mouth was a calculated lie. I had built my company from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks while he was out entertaining clients and secretly sleeping with his assistant. Speaking of the assistant, I turned my head slightly to look at the visitor gallery. Sitting right in the front row was Chloe. She was 24 years old, freshly out of college, and currently smirking at me. But it was not her arrogant expression that made my blood boil. It was the jewelry resting against her collarbone. She was wearing a vintage pear-shaped diamond necklace. It was not just any necklace. It was the exact piece of jewelry my late mother had left to me in her will. Julian had stolen it from my safe 2 weeks ago, claiming it was misplaced during our separation. Seeing it on his mistress right in the middle of a federal courtroom took a level of disrespect I could barely comprehend. I grabbed a pen and quickly scribbled a note to Elias. "She is wearing my mother's diamonds." Elias barely glanced at the paper. He calmly placed his hand over mine and whispered, "Just wait. Let him feel like a king for a few more minutes." Julian's lawyer, a tall man with a booming voice, approached the bench, carrying a thick manila folder. "Your Honor, my client has been more than generous during this marriage," he announced loudly. "But we have undeniable proof that Miss Jada willingly surrendered her right to any of the marital estate, including the suburban home and the joint investment accounts." The judge frowned and adjusted his glasses. "What kind of proof, counselor?" The lawyer dramatically opened the folder and pulled out a crisp, white document. "We are submitting into evidence a post-nuptial agreement signed by both parties exactly 1 year ago. In this document, the respondent clearly waives all claims to my client's financial assets and agrees to walk away with only her personal checking account." The air in the courtroom seemed to evaporate. I stared at the piece of paper in the lawyer's hand. A post-nuptial agreement? I had never seen that document in my life, let alone signed it. Julian looked over at me from the witness stand and offered a slow, victorious wink. He genuinely believed he had backed me into a corner. He thought this forged piece of paper was his golden ticket to ruin my life and take everything I had worked for. My heart pounded against my ribs, but then I remembered the secret Elias and I had uncovered just 48 hours prior. Julian was about to learn that playing dirty with a crisis manager was the biggest mistake of his entire pathetic life. He was completely unaware of the absolute destruction heading his way today. I smiled back. But my smile vanished the second Elias handed me the copy of the document. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It looked exactly like my handwriting, right down to the slight slant of the letter J. Julian had not just forged my signature, he had hired a professional to trace it perfectly. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Before Elias could formally object to this fabricated piece of evidence, Julian's lawyer cleared his throat and addressed the judge again. Your Honor, to corroborate the validity of this agreement, and to shed light on the respondent's true character, we would like to call our next witness to the stand. I turned around expecting to see one of Julian's wealthy country club friends, or perhaps his manipulative mother. Instead, the heavy courtroom doors swung open and my breath hitched in my throat. Walking down the center aisle wearing a conservative beige dress and a practiced look of sympathy was Ashley. She was my older brother Derek's wife, my own sister-in-law. Ashley was a white woman from a wealthy Connecticut suburb who had always looked down her nose at my family. She took the oath and sat in the witness box, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Julian did not even look at her, but Chloe smirked from the gallery. I leaned toward Elias and whispered, "What is she doing here? My brother does not even know about this trial today." Elias kept his eyes locked on Ashley. "We are about to find out," he replied softly. Julian's lawyer approached the stand with a warm, welcoming smile. "Miss Ashley, thank you for being here today. Could you please describe the dynamic of the marriage between Julian and your sister-in-law?" Ashley let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. It was heartbreaking to watch, honestly. Julian tried so hard to build a traditional loving home, but Jada was never around. She cared more about her silly little public relations project than she did about being a supportive wife. I gripped the edge of the wooden defense table so hard my knuckles turned white. My silly little project brought in $3 million last year, while her husband, my brother, was constantly borrowing money from me to cover their mortgage. The lawyer nodded sympathetically. "And how did Julian handle this alleged neglect?" Ashley looked directly at the judge, her eyes wide and innocent. "Julian was an absolute saint. Your Honor, he was the sole provider. He practically rescued her. Coming from her background, well, Julian was the true savior of her family. He paid for dinners, he bought gifts, he elevated their entire standard of living. Without his wealth and generosity, I do not know where her family would be today." The subtle racial and class prejudice in her voice was unmistakable. She was painting my hard-working African-American family as charity cases who relied entirely on the wealthy, successful executive. The sheer audacity of her lies was staggering. My parents had worked tirelessly their entire lives, and I had paid my own way through college. Julian had never given my family a single dime. In fact, he frequently complained about having to attend our family gatherings. Julian's lawyer paced in front of the witness box, letting Ashley's toxic words hang in the silent courtroom. "Miss Ashley," he continued, his tone turning serious, "did the respondent ever express any malice toward her husband? Did she ever indicate that she was staying in the marriage solely for financial gain?" Ashley nodded vigorously. "Yes, absolutely. I remember a family dinner a few months ago. Jada had too much wine and she pulled me aside. She told me she was tired of playing the dutiful wife." The lawyer paused for dramatic effect. "And what exactly did she say she was going to do?" Ashley looked me dead in the eye, her expression completely devoid of guilt. "She told me she was going to drain his accounts. She explicitly said she planned to completely bankrupt Julian and take every last penny he had before she filed for divorce." The courtroom erupted into a low, shocked murmur. The judge slammed his gavel down, demanding order, but the damage was already done. He turned his head and glared sternly down at me, his expression hardened with clear disgust. Ashley sat back in her chair looking incredibly satisfied with her performance. She thought she had just handed Julian the ultimate victory and secured her own financial reward. She believed her malicious perjury would guarantee her a massive payout from my deceitful husband, but in reality she was simply providing me with the exact ammunition I needed to completely destroy them both without a single ounce of mercy in court today. The judge slammed his wooden gavel loudly against the sounding block and announced a brief recess before he would make a ruling on the newly submitted documents. I did not wait for Julian to stand up. I pushed my chair back and marched straight out the heavy oak doors into the crowded courthouse hallway. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but my mind was sharply focused on the betrayal. I scanned the corridor and quickly spotted my older brother Derek standing near the water fountain, with Ashley tightly clinging to his arm. I walked right up to them, blocking their path to the exit. I looked directly into Derek's eyes and asked him how he could possibly sit there in silence and let his wife lie under oath to destroy his own sister. Derek shifted his weight nervously and looked down at the polished marble floor, completely unable to meet my steady gaze. He had always been intimidated by Ashley and her wealthy family, but watching him cower in the hallway was a new level of heartbreak. Before Derek could open his mouth to mumble a pathetic apology, Ashley stepped defensively in front of him. She crossed her arms and told me to back off, claiming she only told the judge the absolute truth about my selfish behavior. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but I kept my voice perfectly level. I looked right at her and told Ashley that perjury was a serious federal crime, and she had just handed me the rope I needed to hang her with. Derek finally looked up, his eyes wide with panic, but Ashley just rolled her eyes, grabbed his arm forcefully and pulled him down the hallway toward the elevators. I watched my own flesh and blood walk away, choosing a lie over our shared family history. "Take a deep breath," Elias said, appearing quietly at my side. Before I could respond, the loud clicking of designer heels echoed on the marble floor right behind us. I turned around to see Chloe strutting directly toward me with an iced latte in one hand and a folded piece of white paper in the other. She was practically glowing with smug satisfaction. She stopped a few feet away, taking a slow, dramatic sip of her drink, while making absolutely sure the stolen vintage diamond necklace caught the bright overhead lights. She held out the piece of paper toward me, her lips curled into a nasty, mocking smile. I did not reach for it, so she simply dropped it onto the wooden bench beside me with a dismissive flick of her wrist. She casually informed me that it was an official eviction notice. She boldly stated that Julian and she were moving into my suburban marital home next week, and I needed to have all my personal belongings packed and removed by Monday morning. She laughed a high-pitched grating sound and suggested I move back to the rough neighborhood I came from, because I clearly did not belong in their high society world anymore. My hands balled into tight fists at my sides. Every single instinct inside my body screamed at me to wipe that arrogant smirk off her face right then and there. I stepped forward, ready to unleash my fury, but Elias firmly placed his hand on my shoulder and pulled me back gently. He leaned down and whispered softly in my ear, telling me to let them get overconfident, because an arrogant enemy is always a careless enemy. I took a breath, letting Chloe walk away. She practically skipped back down the hall to find Julian oblivious to the legal trap Elias had already set. Elias patted my back and suggested we head down to the courthouse cafeteria to grab a coffee and strategize our next move. We rode the elevator down to the basement in silence. The cafeteria was noisy and crowded with stressed lawyers and anxious families. I walked up to the counter, ordered 2 coffees, and handed my debit card to the cashier. The woman swiped the card through the machine, but it beeped loudly, displaying a red error message. She frowned and swiped it a second time with the same result. She looked up at me with an apologetic smile and said my card had been declined. I frowned, pulling out my business credit card instead, knowing it had a massive available balance. She inserted the chip, but the machine rejected it instantly. A cold, creeping sensation washed over my body. I pulled out my phone and quickly logged into my banking application. The screen loaded slowly, and my stomach dropped to the floor. Every bank account tied to my name displayed a balance of exactly $0, abruptly frozen by court order. Every bank account tied to my name displayed a balance of exactly $0, abruptly frozen by court order. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, unable to comprehend the sheer speed of his sabotage. I did not even bother returning to the courtroom to hear the judge. I sprinted out of the courthouse doors, ignoring the heavy Chicago wind, and flagged down a passing taxi. I ordered the driver to take me directly to the main corporate branch of my business bank. The ride felt like a terrifying eternity. My mind raced through every financial decision I had made over the last 5 years trying to find a mistake. I marched through the polished glass doors of the bank and demanded to see the branch manager immediately. Mr. Davis, a man I had done business with for years, looked genuinely uncomfortable when I stepped into his office. He gestured for me to sit down, but I stood firmly planted in front of his heavy mahogany desk. I demanded to know how my accounts could be frozen without my consent, or a finalized divorce decree. Mr. Davis nervously adjusted his tie and pulled up my file on his computer monitor. He explained that Julian's legal team had filed an emergency injunction early this morning. They used a notarized post-nuptial agreement as undeniable proof that I had already surrendered my financial rights to the marital estate and the business assets. I slammed my hands down on the desk and told him the document was a complete and utter forgery. I practically shouted, reminding Mr. Davis that I built my public relations firm entirely from the ground up with my own sweat and tears. I worked relentlessly to secure every single client while Julian was too busy playing golf and entertaining his mistresses on the company dime. I never took a single penny of his money to fund my operations, and the bank records proved it. Mr. Davis looked at me with a sympathetic but completely helpless expression. He stated that the bank had to comply with a judge-signed court order, regardless of my claims of criminal forgery. But then Mr. Davis dropped an even heavier bombshell on my chest. He informed me that the freeze was not just limited to my liquid cash and checking accounts. Julian had also taken legal control of my physical office space. I stepped back, feeling the air leave my lungs. I asked him how that was legally possible since my company name alone was on the front door. Mr. Davis gently reminded me of a desperate decision I made 5 years ago when I first launched the firm. Back then, my business was brand new and lacked the corporate credit history required to secure a prime commercial lease in downtown Chicago. Julian had offered to co-sign the initial lease agreement as a guarantor to help me out. He never paid a single month of rent, but his signature remained permanently attached to the master document. Now Julian's lawyers were using that old CO signer status combined with the forged agreement to claim he was the primary financial stakeholder of the property. They had officially changed the security codes and the physical locks to the building just an hour ago. I was completely locked out of my own headquarters. My desktop computers, my confidential client files, my entire livelihood were now trapped behind a door I could no longer open. The financial stranglehold was absolute and ruthless. Julian had meticulously planned this targeted attack to cut off all my resources simultaneously, leaving me with absolutely nothing to fight back with. He wanted me broke. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me begging for mercy on my knees. I walked out of the bank feeling a cold numbness wash over my entire body. I stood on the busy city sidewalk watching the world move around me while my entire life was being systematically dismantled. I needed to call Elias immediately. I needed to figure out how to pay my mounting legal fees without a single dollar to my name. Before I could even dial his phone number, my cell phone started ringing frantically in my hand. The caller identification showed the name of my executive assistant, Maya. I answered the call expecting her to complain about the office door codes being changed by building security. Instead, her voice came through the speaker, pitched abnormally high with sheer panic. She was crying hysterically. I told her to take a deep breath and explain exactly what was happening right now. Maya stuttered through her tears, saying that the emergency office phone lines had been ringing off the hook all morning. Our top 3 celebrity clients had just called her to terminate their public relations contracts effective immediately. I asked her why they would cancel without speaking to me first. Maya took a shaky breath and delivered the final crushing blow to my day. She said Julian had been personally contacting my elite client list all morning. He was leaking a highly detailed fabricated story to them, claiming that my accounts were frozen because I was currently under an active federal investigation for corporate embezzlement. I ended the call with Maya feeling a burning sensation in my chest. Julian was actively trying to destroy my professional reputation and my freedom. I needed answers, and I needed them immediately. There was only one place I knew I could find Derek this weekend. Every Sunday, my family gathered for traditional dinner. It was a ritual we had maintained for decades, long before Ashley ever entered the picture. I got back into my taxi and gave the driver my brother's address in the suburbs. When I pushed open the heavy wooden front door of Derek's house, the rich, familiar smell of soul food washed over me. The dining room table was covered with steaming platters of fried chicken, baked macaroni and cheese, and slow-cooked collard greens. Under normal circumstances, this was my safe haven. Today, the atmosphere in the room was thick and incredibly toxic. Derek was sitting at the head of the table holding a glass of iced tea. Ashley sat next to him, picking at a piece of cornbread with a smug expression on her face. My mother was absent, visiting her sister out of state, which meant Derek and Ashley were completely alone in their treacherous victory. I walked straight into the dining room, ignoring the food entirely. I slammed my purse down on the edge of the table, making the silverware rattle. I looked directly at my brother and demanded to know exactly how much his soul cost. I asked him how he could sit in a federal courtroom and let his wife commit perjury to destroy my life. Derek flinched and set his glass down, refusing to look me in the eye. He opened his mouth to mumble an excuse, but Ashley immediately raised her hand to silence him. She stood up, smoothing down her expensive linen trousers, and glared at me across the table. She told me I needed to lower my voice and know my place in her home. She laughed, a cold, bitter sound, and said I had always been entirely too proud for my own good. She stated that I walked around with my successful business and my designer clothes, acting like I was better than everyone else in the family. Ashley leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the table, and delivered the ultimate betrayal with a cruel smile. She proudly admitted that Julian came to them weeks ago with a brilliant business proposition. Derek had been drowning in debt for months, secretly facing foreclosure on this very house. Julian promised to pay off their entire mortgage in a single lump sum if Ashley agreed to testify against me and help him secure 80% of my company. My own brother had sold my livelihood to a narcissistic abuser just to save his suburban house. I looked at Derek, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to defend me. He just stared at his plate, completely paralyzed by his own cowardice and his manipulative wife. My family had been bought and paid for by the man who was actively trying to ruin me. The betrayal ran so deep it felt like a physical wound. Ashley crossed her arms and smugly told me to leave and accept my defeat gracefully. She said Julian was too powerful and I was completely outmatched. Every instinct inside me screamed to flip the table and tear her apart with my bare hands. But my years in crisis management kicked in sharply. Screaming would not win this war. Rage would not get my bank accounts unfrozen. I needed hard, undeniable proof of their conspiracy to commit perjury and fraud. I forced my breathing to slow down and let my shoulders slump forward, acting as if her words had finally broken my spirit. I looked down at the floor, completely silent. I slowly reached into my purse, acting as if I was grabbing a tissue to wipe my eyes. Instead, my fingers wrapped around a small voice-activated digital recorder I always carried for client meetings. I pretended to lose my balance slightly, knocking my purse over and dropping my napkin onto the hardwood floor. As I crouched down to pick it up, I reached under the thick wooden pedestal of the dining table and pressed the magnetic back of the recorder firmly against the wood. I clicked the tiny record button on. I stood back up, keeping my head bowed and my face completely passive. I told them both I hoped the house was worth it. I turned around and walked out the front door, leaving them to celebrate their fake victory, completely unaware that I had just planted a deadly trap right under their noses. They thought they had destroyed me completely today, but the war was far from over. I hung up the phone with Maya and took a long, deep breath. Julian wanted to play a public relations game with a master of the craft. He was underestimating my ability to control a narrative. I spent the rest of Sunday night drafting a battle plan. By Monday morning, the damage was spreading like a wildfire. My cell phone had not stopped ringing. Maya was managing the front lines from her kitchen table, since we were both legally barred from entering our own downtown office building. At 9 o'clock sharp, I received the phone call I had been dreading the most. It was Marcus Vance, the chief executive officer of a massive tech conglomerate, and my absolute biggest client. His account alone kept my firm highly profitable. He did not bother with pleasantries when I answered the phone. He bluntly stated that his board of directors was extremely nervous about the rumors circulating in the financial circles. He said they could not afford to have their company associated with a public relations manager who was supposedly facing federal embezzlement charges. He told me he was officially terminating our contract to protect his own brand identity. I did not panic, and I certainly did not beg. I immediately shifted into full crisis management mode, using the exact same aggressive tactics I used to save my clients from their own scandals. I kept my voice perfectly calm and authoritative. I told Marcus that the rumors were completely fabricated by a disgruntled soon-to-be ex-husband who was attempting to leverage a divorce settlement. I reminded Marcus of the time his own former business partner tried to destroy his reputation with fake leak stories 3 years ago. I asked him if he remembered who systematically dismantled those lies and saved his stock prices from plummeting. I let the silence hang on the line for a moment. Then I made him an offer he could not refuse. I told him I would handle his account completely free of charge for the next 30 days. I promised him that within those 30 days, I would publicly and legally obliterate the source of these rumors, proving my innocence and my unwavering resilience. I warned him that if he walked away now, he would be showing weakness to the exact same media outlets we had fought so hard to conquer. Marcus sighed heavily into the receiver. He admired loyalty, and he respected strength. He agreed to give me the 30 days, but warned me that I better deliver on my promises. I ended the call feeling a small surge of victory. I had successfully stopped the bleeding, but I still needed a tourniquet. An hour later, I walked into a dingy, greasy spoon diner on the outskirts of the city. The linoleum floors were sticky, and the smell of burnt coffee filled the air. It was a sharp contrast to the luxury high-rise office I was used to, but it was the only place I could safely meet with Elias without being seen by Julian's wealthy friends. Elias was already sitting in a cracked vinyl booth in the back corner, drinking from a chipped ceramic mug. I slid into the booth across from him and updated him on the situation with my clients. I explained how Julian had weaponized the forged post-nuptial agreement to freeze my accounts and lock me out of my own headquarters. I told him I was practically operating my multi-million-dollar empire from my cell phone and Maya's kitchen table. Elias listened quietly, his expression completely unreadable. He set his coffee mug down and pulled a thick manila envelope from his worn leather briefcase. He slid the envelope across the sticky table toward me. He told me he had spent the entire weekend calling in favors from old friends in the banking sector. He said Julian was moving faster and more aggressively than a typical greedy ex-husband. Elias explained that when someone strikes with this much desperate force, it usually means they are trying to cover up a much bigger crime. I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of bank statements and property records. I scanned the top document and felt my heart drop into my stomach. It was a copy of a commercial loan agreement approved just 3 weeks ago. Elias leaned forward and tapped his index finger against a specific line of text. He revealed that Julian had secretly taken out a $2 million cash loan by borrowing against the equity of our suburban marital home. But the most terrifying part was not the massive debt he had chained me to. Elias looked me dead in the eyes and stated that the entire $2 million had completely vanished from the grid. I stared at Elias, trying to process the magnitude of what he was telling me. $2 million does not just evaporate into thin air, I argued, keeping my voice low so the waitress clearing the table next to us would not hear our private conversation. People can disappear, but digital money always leaves a paper trail. Elias nodded in absolute agreement. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a brief, urgent phone call. He told me we were bringing in the heavy artillery. Less than an hour later, a woman named Sarah walked into the greasy diner. Sarah was a veteran forensic accountant who specialized specifically in high net worth divorces and corporate financial fraud. She slid into the cracked vinyl booth next to Elias, setting a thick encrypted laptop on the sticky table. She did not bother with polite introductions or small talk. She simply asked for my social security number and the exact name of Julian's investment fund. I gave Sarah full authorization to access my personal credit reports and the frozen business accounts. For 3 agonizing hours, Elias and I sat in that dismal diner, drinking cup after cup of terrible black coffee. We watched in silence as Sarah barely blinked, typing furiously and tracing complex digital breadcrumbs across multiple international banking networks. Julian was a senior vice president at a major investment fund, so he knew exactly how to move money securely. He knew how to hide massive amounts of capital from the Internal Revenue Service, and he certainly knew how to hide it from a local family court judge. He was incredibly arrogant, but he was absolutely not stupid. However, Sarah was simply an apex predator in the financial world. She was much better at hunting hidden money than Julian was at burying it. She finally hit the enter key with a loud, satisfying click and turned her laptop screen toward me. She wore a triumphant smirk. She explained that Julian did not blow the missing $2 million on luxury sports cars, designer handbags, or expensive vacations for his young mistress Chloe. He was playing a much longer and far more sinister game behind everyone's back. The bright computer screen displayed a highly complex web of wire transfers. Sarah pointed her pen at the screen, showing how Julian had routed the cash through 3 different domestic shell corporations operating out of Delaware. From there, the money was wired directly into a highly secure offshore trust account based entirely in the Cayman Islands. The offshore account was officially registered under the corporate name CJ Holdings. Sarah explained that Cayman Island bank accounts are notoriously difficult for American family courts to subpoena due to strict international privacy laws and banking protections. Julian had meticulously liquidated the entire equity of our shared marital home and funneled that massive pile of cash directly into this untouchable offshore fortress. His master plan was brilliantly evil. He intended to claim absolute poverty during our final divorce proceedings. He was going to let the bank completely foreclose on our house and walk away clean with $2 million safely hidden out of the country where I could never touch it. I felt a sharp wave of cold nausea wash over me. He had essentially stolen my half of the house and left me holding an empty bag of massive debt. I took a deep breath and asked Sarah how Julian managed to open a corporate offshore trust without triggering any major international banking security flags. Opening a secure account in the Cayman Islands usually requires rigorous background checks, massive initial deposits, and a highly vetted secondary corporate guarantor. Sarah frowned, her eyes darting across the screen as she started typing rapidly again. She was digging deep into the original incorporation documents of CJ Holdings. A few tense moments later, the color completely drained from her face. She stopped typing and looked up at me with an expression of pure disbelief. I asked her what she found. She slowly turned the laptop screen back toward me and zoomed in closely on the guarantor registration line. Julian did not just forge my personal signature to freeze my local bank accounts. To completely bypass the strict international banking regulations and quickly open his secret offshore trust, he needed an established American corporation to vouch for the new foreign entity. He had illegally used the exact federal tax identification number of my public relations firm. My very own successful business was now legally tethered to his hidden offshore fortune. If the federal government ever found out the truth about this unauthorized account, my entire company would be completely destroyed by massive federal tax evasion charges. He was secretly using all my life's work as a human shield. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Elias closed his eyes and rubbed his temples, letting out a slow, frustrated breath. He explained that if we brought this offshore account to the judge right now, Julian could easily claim I opened it myself, to hide my own assets. Since my company tax identification number was attached to the account, I was the one who looked like the criminal. We needed irrefutable proof of Julian's overarching conspiracy to destroy me before we could safely expose the hidden money. I knew exactly where to find that proof. I told Elias about the voice-activated digital recorder I had planted under the dining room table at my brother's house on Sunday. Elias leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a mix of caution and sharp approval. He told me that unauthorized recordings were a legal gray area, but in a family court fraud case, a judge might allow it if it proved rampant perjury. I just had to get the device back without getting caught. The next afternoon, I drove my car back to the quiet, wealthy suburb where Derek and Ashley lived. I knew Derek would be at his corporate office until 6 o'clock, which meant Ashley would be home alone. I sat in my parked car for a few minutes, taking deep breaths and practicing my facial expressions in the rearview mirror. My career in crisis management required me to read emotions perfectly, but today, I needed to perform them. I forced myself to think about losing my mother and losing my business until genuine tears welled up in my eyes. I walked up the paved driveway and rang the doorbell. Ashley opened the heavy front door, wearing a silk designer robe and holding a glass of sparkling water. When she saw me standing on her porch with red eyes and a defeated posture, her lips instantly curled into a highly satisfied smirk. I kept my voice low and shaky. I told her I was completely exhausted from fighting and that my lawyer had warned me I was going to lose everything. I asked if I could come inside for just a few minutes to talk and make peace for the sake of our family. Ashley loved nothing more than feeling superior to me. She stepped aside and graciously waved me into the house, treating me like a defeated peasant begging for mercy from a queen. We walked straight into the dining room. The room was perfectly clean, and the large wooden pedestal table sat empty in the center. Ashley sat down in the large chair at the head of the table, gesturing lazily for me to sit adjacent to her. She told me she was glad I finally realized I was out of my league. She said Julian was simply a better class of person, and I should be grateful he tolerated me for as long as he did. I nodded slowly, forcing a few more tears to spill down my cheeks. I apologized for my behavior on Sunday and told her I just wanted to move on with my life. Ashley soaked up every single word of my fake apology. She smiled brightly and decided to humiliate me just a little bit more. She complained that her throat was dry and pointed toward an expensive crystal pitcher of iced tea sitting on the wooden buffet cabinet behind me. She asked me to be a good guest and pour her a glass. I stood up, keeping my head bowed obediently. I poured the tea, but as I turned back around, I intentionally bumped my hip hard against the heavy dining chair. The crystal glass slipped from my fingers and shattered loudly against the hardwood floor, sending iced tea everywhere. Ashley shrieked and jumped up from the table, yelling at me for being clumsy. I dropped to my knees immediately, apologizing frantically and using my bare hands to gather the broken pieces of glass. While Ashley was busy inspecting her silk robe for wet spots, my left hand shot out and reached under the thick wooden pedestal of the dining table. My fingers brushed against the small plastic rectangle. I grabbed the magnetic recorder, pulled it free, and quickly shoved it deep into the pocket of my trousers. I grabbed a few napkins from the table, wiped up the spill, and stood back up. Ashley rolled her eyes in deep disgust and told me to get out of her house before I broke anything else. I nodded meekly and walked out the front door, keeping my head down until I reached my car. Once I was safely locked inside my vehicle, my defeated posture instantly vanished. I pulled the small black device from my pocket and plugged it directly into my laptop. I skipped through hours of dead air and meaningless household chatter. Finally, I hit a section of audio recorded late Sunday night. The clear, distinct sound of Ashley's voice filled the quiet interior of my car. She was on the phone with Julian. Her tone was no longer sweet or supportive. It was cold and demanding. I listened as Ashley confidently told him, "I perjured myself for you, Julian. I lied to the judge just like we planned. Now you need to wire the $50,000 to my private account today, or I will go straight back to that courthouse and tell the judge absolutely everything." I smiled, resting my head against the steering wheel. I finally had the loaded gun I needed to blow their entire conspiracy to pieces. Armed with the explosive audio recording on my laptop, I knew exactly where I needed to strike next. Friday night marked the most anticipated high society event in Chicago. The Metropolitan Hospital Charity Gala was being held at the Grand Plaza Hotel. It was not just a fundraiser. Tonight was secretly serving as a massive celebration for Julian. The senior partners at his firm were planning to formally announce his promotion to Chief Executive Officer. The ballroom was packed with the wealthiest and most influential people in the city. The people Julian desperately needed to impress. I did not have an invitation, but my career in crisis public relations meant I knew every single event coordinator in the building. I slipped past the velvet ropes through the service kitchen and stepped directly into the glittering ballroom. The room was a sea of custom tuxedos and expensive designer gowns. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the wealthy crowd. I spotted Julian immediately. He was standing near the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of powerful bank executives, holding a glass of champagne and laughing loudly. Chloe was clinging tightly to his arm, wearing another stolen piece of my jewelry. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked straight toward them. The moment Julian saw me approaching, his confident smile instantly vanished. The executives around him stopped laughing and turned to stare. Julian quickly stepped forward, attempting to block my path and keep his voice low. He fiercely demanded to know what I was doing here and how I managed to get past the security guards. I smiled politely and told him I just wanted to congratulate him on his big promotion. Julian sneered, his eyes darting nervously toward the senior partners watching us. He decided to take the offensive, hoping to publicly embarrass me into leaving. He raised his voice just enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. He boldly stated that I had absolutely no right to be here, especially since I was currently under federal investigation for embezzling money from my own clients. Whispers immediately erupted among the elite guests. People began pointing and staring at me with expressions of pure disgust. Julian signaled a passing waiter and aggressively ordered him to call the building security immediately. He turned back to me and loudly declared that this was a respectable charity event, and they did not tolerate common criminals crashing their private celebrations. He was putting on a spectacular performance, portraying himself as the honorable victim while completely destroying my reputation in front of the most powerful people in Chicago. I stood my ground, refusing to break eye contact or show a single ounce of fear. Seeing my unwavering composure, Chloe decided she needed to insert herself into the drama to defend her wealthy boyfriend. She stepped out from behind Julian holding a full glass of dark red wine. She looked me up and down with an exaggerated expression of pity. She loudly suggested that I must be incredibly desperate for a free meal, since my bank accounts were completely frozen. She took a step closer, and with a malicious smirk, she deliberately tilted her hand forward. The dark red wine splashed directly onto the front of my light-colored silk dress, instantly ruining the expensive fabric. A few guests gasped in shock, but Chloe simply let out a fake, delicate laugh. She sarcastically apologized, claiming her hand slipped. She leaned in close enough for me to smell her perfume and whispered that I should probably get used to wearing stained clothes because I was going to be completely broke for the rest of my miserable life. She was enjoying every single second of my supposed downfall. Two corporate security guards in dark suits quickly pushed their way through the crowd of wealthy spectators. They approached me from behind, firmly grabbing both of my arms to physically escort me out of the massive ballroom. Julian crossed his arms over his chest, looking incredibly satisfied with himself. He told the guards to make sure I was thrown completely off the property immediately. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully humiliated me in front of the entire city and secured his perfect wealthy future. But as the heavy-handed security guards began to pull me backward, I resisted just long enough to take one final deliberate step toward my highly arrogant husband. I leaned my head forward, stopping mere inches from his ear. I did not yell, and I did not threaten him. I kept my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. I softly whispered the secret corporate name, C.J. Holdings. The effect was instantaneous and absolutely magnificent. The warm color violently drained from Julian's face, leaving him looking completely sick. I did not wait for him to recover from the shock. I immediately turned around and let the two confused security guards escort me out the heavy glass doors of the hotel lobby. I stepped out into the chilly night air, pulling my ruined dress tightly around my shoulders. I began walking slowly across the dimly lit parking garage toward my car. I knew he would follow me. A man with a secret that massive cannot simply let a threat walk away in the dark. I counted my steps deliberately, listening to the sharp echo of my heels on the concrete. Just as I reached my sedan, I heard the heavy, frantic pounding of footsteps echoing behind me. "Jada, stop right there," Julian yelled, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw panic and rage. I turned around slowly, leaning back against the driver's side door of my car. Julian was practically sprinting across the pavement, his expensive tuxedo jacket flapping in the wind. He slammed his hand against the roof of my car, breathing heavily, and cornered me against the cold metal. His eyes were wide and wild, completely devoid of his usual polished charm. "Where did you hear that name?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "Who told you about that company, Jada? Tell me right now." This was the moment I had been training for my entire career. I forced my breathing to become shallow and rapid, mimicking genuine terror. I let my shoulders slump forward and allowed my hands to shake visibly. I looked away from him, staring at the concrete floor. "I do not know what you are talking about, Julian," I stammered, my voice sounding small and completely broken. "I just saw the name on a piece of forwarded mail that came to the house before I moved out. It looked like some boring corporate tax document. I did not open it. I just wanted to scare you tonight because you were being so cruel to me in front of everyone." Julian stared at me intensely, searching my tear-streaked face for any sign of deception. He was desperately trying to figure out if I actually understood the massive financial bomb I had just dropped. I needed to convince him that I was completely ignorant and utterly defeated. I let out a loud sob, covering my face with my trembling hands. "I am so tired, Julian," I cried, letting the fake tears flow freely. "I have nothing left. My business accounts are completely frozen. My clients are dropping me. Chloe gets to wear my dead mother's diamonds while I am getting evicted from my own home. You have completely destroyed me. Please just let me go." Julian slowly lowered his hand from the roof of my car, his tense muscles visibly relaxing as he absorbed my pathetic display. I looked up at him with wide, desperate eyes and delivered the final hook. "I just need a little bit of money to secure a cheap apartment and pay my lawyer to finalize the divorce paperwork," I pleaded. "Just $20,000, Julian. If you give me $20,000 tonight, I will sign whatever you want. I will sign a waiver of financial discovery tomorrow. You can keep the house, you can keep your investments, you can keep the public relations firm. I just want this nightmare to be over." The sheer arrogance returned to Julian's face in a blinding flash. He genuinely believed his own superiority had broken my spirit entirely. He thought my mention of his offshore shell company was nothing more than a lucky blind guess from a desperate discarded wife. A cruel, mocking smile slowly spread across his face. $20,000, he scoffed, pulling a sleek leather checkbook from his inner jacket pocket. "You are willing to walk away from a multi-million-dollar marital estate for 20 grand just to run away and hide?" I nodded frantically, keeping up the pathetic charade. "You really are pathetic, Jada." He laughed, shaking his head. "Luckily for you, my lawyer anticipated you might try to beg for a quick settlement, so he drafted the waiver of financial discovery paperwork yesterday." Julian reached into his other pocket and pulled out a folded legal document and a silver pen. He slapped the paper down hard on the cold hood of my car. He quickly wrote out a check for $20,000 and tossed it at my feet. "Sign the waiver right now," he ordered, tapping the pen hard against the paper. "You agree that no further investigation will be done into my corporate assets." I picked up the pen with a shaking hand and signed my name on the dotted line. Julian snatched the paper back, grinning, thinking he had completely outsmarted me tonight. I watched the bright taillights of his luxury sedan disappear into the dark Chicago night. The moment his car turned the corner, the pathetic trembling in my hands completely stopped. My tears dried up instantly, and the terrified victim persona I had just performed flawlessly evaporated into the cold garage air. I bent down and picked up the $20,000 check he had carelessly thrown at my feet. I did not see it as a lifeline or a desperate settlement. I saw it as a physical receipt of his overwhelming arrogance. I tucked the check safely into my purse and walked back to my car, feeling a surge of pure adrenaline. The next morning, I sat across from Elias in his private downtown office. The heavy oak door was locked, and the blinds were drawn tightly shut. I recounted every single detail of my parking garage performance to him. I explained how I manipulated Julian's massive ego to secure the exact reaction we wanted. I told him about the waiver of financial discovery I had signed on the hood of my car. Julian had snatched it back with such greedy desperation, convinced he had just permanently sealed away his hidden fortune. Elias leaned back in his leather chair and let out a deep, booming laugh. It was a rare sound from the usually stoic veteran attorney. He took off his reading glasses and looked at me with immense professional respect. He said my ability to read human behavior was genuinely terrifying. He pulled a thick legal pad across his desk and began mapping out the exact parameters of the trap we had just successfully set. Elias explained the absolute brilliance of the situation. Julian believed that by forcing me to sign that specific waiver, he was legally barring my legal team from ever investigating his personal accounts or uncovering his offshore shell company. But Julian had made a fatal miscalculation when he originally set up the Cayman Islands account. Elias tapped his pen against the paper, emphasizing every single word. Because Julian illegally used the federal tax identification number of my public relations firm to act as the corporate guarantor for CJ Holdings, the Internal Revenue Service already recognized me as the primary legal owner of the offshore trust. I did not need to investigate his hidden assets because on paper, the $8 million was already firmly attached to my business. By making me sign that waiver, Julian had essentially built a massive legal wall around the money to keep me out. He completely failed to realize that I was already standing on the inside of the wall, and he had just locked himself on the outside. I smiled, feeling the heavy weight of the past few weeks finally begin to lift off my shoulders. I asked Elias what our next move should be now that the money was technically sitting under my corporate umbrella. Elias leaned forward, his expression turning deadly serious. He explained that claiming the money was only half of the battle. We did not just want to recover the stolen marital funds. We wanted to completely destroy Julian's ability to ever hurt anyone else again. We wanted him to face severe federal consequences for his fraud. Elias stated that the waiver of financial discovery meant the judge would likely try to expedite the final divorce decree. Julian would be feeling invincible walking into the courtroom, believing his secrets were entirely safe. But Elias had a specific strategy to bypass the waiver. During the final hearing, Elias planned to ask Julian one simple, direct question regarding his knowledge of any foreign entities. It was a standard procedural question that the judge would allow despite the signed waiver. The final piece of our puzzle relied entirely on Julian's narcissistic confidence. Elias explained that a man who believes he has already won will never hesitate to lie to protect his prize. We had the irrefutable banking documents from Sarah, the forensic accountant. We had the tax identification records linking my firm to the Cayman accounts. We had the audio recording of Ashley confessing to their orchestrated perjury. All the ammunition was perfectly lined up and loaded into the chamber. We just needed Julian to confidently take the witness stand one final time. We needed him to look the judge dead in the eye and officially deny under oath that he owned any part of the offshore trust. The moment those specific deceitful words left his highly arrogant mouth, he would be committing felony perjury in open court, while simultaneously legally disowning his entire stolen fortune forever. We just had to wait patiently for the final court hearing to arrive and let him willingly step right into the tightening legal snare we had carefully prepared for him. We just had to wait patiently for the final court hearing to arrive and let him willingly step right into the tightening legal snare we had carefully prepared for him. But before we could deliver the final blow to Julian, we had to systematically remove the pawns he had placed on the board. The very next week, the judge scheduled a preliminary hearing to determine the temporary custody of the marital home. Julian had petitioned the court to officially evict me and grant him immediate possession of the property before the final divorce was even finalized. I walked into the courtroom feeling a strange sense of calm. Julian was sitting at the plaintiff table, wearing another expensive suit and looking incredibly confident. He had officially received the waiver I signed, and he believed this hearing was just a minor formality before he could toss my belongings into the street. Julian's lawyer stood up and requested to call Ashley back to the witness stand to reaffirm her previous testimony regarding my alleged financial irresponsibility and malicious intent to bankrupt her husband. The judge allowed it. Ashley walked down the center aisle wearing a conservative navy blue blazer and a matching pencil skirt. She took the oath and sat down in the witness box, folding her hands neatly. She looked directly at me with a smug, satisfied expression. My brother Derek was sitting in the front row of the gallery watching his wife with a tense, worried look on his face. Julian's lawyer asked Ashley a few brief questions, allowing her to confidently repeat her fabricated story. She eloquently detailed how I had supposedly confessed my plan to drain Julian's accounts during a family dinner. She painted herself as a concerned, neutral party who just wanted to see justice served for a generous man who had supported our family. When the lawyer finished questioning her, he confidently yielded the floor to Elias. Elias stood up slowly, adjusting his tie, and approached the witness stand. He did not look angry or aggressive. In fact, he looked almost bored. He asked Ashley a few standard questions about her relationship with Julian and her general knowledge of his finances. She answered each question smoothly, clearly rehearsed, and ready to defend her lies. Then Elias paused and looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "Miss Ashley," he said, his voice echoing clearly in the quiet courtroom, "are you absolutely certain that your testimony today and your previous testimony are entirely truthful and uninfluenced by any outside factors?" Ashley raised her chin slightly and answered, "Yes, absolutely." Elias took a step closer to the witness box. "Have you received or been promised any form of financial compensation or personal favors from Julian in exchange for your testimony against your sister-in-law?" Ashley let out a small, offended gasp. "No, I have not," she replied, her voice laced with righteous indignation. "I am simply telling the truth about Jadis' behavior." Elias turned away from her and walked back to our table. He picked up his laptop and connected a small auxiliary cable to the courtroom's speaker system. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge calmly, "we would like to submit a brief audio recording into evidence that directly contradicts this witness's sworn testimony." Julian's lawyer immediately stood up to object, claiming he had not been provided with any audio files during discovery. Elias smoothly reminded the court that the audio was recently obtained and was being used strictly for impeachment purposes to prove the witness was currently committing perjury. The judge overruled the objection and instructed Elias to play the recording. The courtroom fell completely silent as Elias pressed the spacebar on his laptop. The crisp, clear audio of Ashley's voice instantly filled the room. "I perjured myself for you, Julian. I lied to the judge just like we planned. Now you need to wire the $50,000 to my private account today, or I will go straight back to that courthouse and tell the judge absolutely everything." The recording stopped, and the silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Ashley's face turned a sickening shade of pale gray. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked wildly around the room as if searching for an escape route. Julian stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. He knew his perfectly constructed narrative was beginning to unravel. The judge slammed his gavel down hard, glaring at Ashley with intense fury. He immediately ordered her testimony to be completely stricken from the official court record. He instructed the bailiff to cite her for direct contempt of court and informed her that he would be forwarding the audio recording to the district attorney's office for potential criminal perjury charges. Ashley began to cry, genuine tears of panic streaming down her face as she stepped down from the witness box. She looked toward the gallery seeking comfort from her husband, but Derek was not looking at her with sympathy. He was staring at the woman he married with an expression of absolute horror and deep disgust, finally realizing the true extent of her greedy, malicious betrayal. The bailiff formally dismissed the courtroom, and I walked out into the brightly lit hallway feeling a massive weight finally lifted off my chest. Elias patted my shoulder and told me he was going to file the perjury paperwork. I nodded and leaned against the marble wall, taking a deep breath. Before I could enjoy a minute of peace, the heavy wooden doors banged open. Ashley stormed out of the courtroom, her face red from crying. The moment she spotted me, her panic transformed into blind, irrational rage. She marched straight toward me, pointing a trembling finger. "You set me up!" she screamed, her voice echoing loudly down the corridor. "You deliberately trapped me, Jada. You came to my house pretending to cry, just to illegally record me and ruin my life." I stood perfectly still, letting her throw her tantrum. "You ruined your own life, Ashley," I replied calmly. "You chose to lie under oath for $50,000. Ashley let out a hysterical, bitter laugh. "I only did it because your family is a financial burden," she yelled, losing whatever filter she had left. "Derek is constantly broke, and you people expect everyone else to clean up your messes. Julian offered us a way out of your pathetic drama, and I took it. I deserve that money for putting up with this family." She was practically vibrating with anger, exposing the deep-seated prejudice and entitlement she always hid behind fake smiles. She raised her hand as if she wanted to strike me, but a tall figure stepped directly between us. It was Derek. He did not look nervous or intimidated anymore. He stood up straight, squaring his shoulders, and looked down at his wife with a cold, hard expression I had never seen before. "Do not ever speak to my sister like that again," he commanded, his voice deep and unwavering. Ashley blinked in shock, stepping back. "Derek, what are you doing?" she stammered, shifting back to her fake victim persona. "She just destroyed me in there." Derek shook his head slowly, a look of profound disgust washing over his face. "No, Ashley, you destroyed yourself," he said firmly. "I sat in that courtroom and listened to you beg Julian for money. You sold out my sister to a man who abused her just so you could line your pockets." Ashley tried to grab his arm, but he quickly pulled away. "I was doing it for us, Derek," she cried defensively. "I was trying to save our home from foreclosure." Derek let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You were not doing it for us, you greedy manipulator," he fired back. "You did it because you are obsessed with status. You have always looked down on my family because of where we come from and the color of our skin. You thought we were stupid enough to let you take control. I have spent years letting you disrespect my mother and sister to keep the peace. But I am done being a coward. I am completely done with you, Ashley." Ashley stared at him, her mouth hanging open. "What exactly are you saying?" she demanded in a harsh whisper. "I am saying I am filing for divorce this afternoon," Derek announced clearly. "I want you to pack your designer clothes and get out of my house before I return tonight. If you are still there, I will have the police escort you off the property." A nasty, vicious sneer twisted her features. She crossed her arms tightly. "You think you can just kick me out?" She laughed loudly. "We have been married for 5 years, Derek. That house is marital property, and I am legally entitled to exactly half of it. I will force you to sell it so I get my share." Derek did not flinch. Instead, a slow, satisfied smile spread across his face, mirroring the exact same confident expression I wore when I trapped Julian. Go ahead and hire the best lawyer to fight me, Ashley. He replied, his tone perfectly calm and collected. But you are going to be severely disappointed when you read the fine print. When we fell behind on the mortgage payments 6 months ago, I secretly went to my mother for financial help because I was desperate. She generously paid off the entire bank loan in full, but she had her lawyers completely restructure the property deed to protect our family. That house is no longer in my personal name. It is legally owned 100% by my mother's irrevocable family trust, which means it cannot be touched by a divorce settlement. You are not entitled to a single brick of that property. You sold your dark, greedy soul for absolutely nothing, Ashley, and now you get absolutely nothing. I left Derek standing in the hallway watching his soon-to-be ex-wife completely crumble under the weight of her own greed. I walked out the heavy doors. With Ashley officially neutralized and my brother finally free from her toxic grip, I could fully turn my attention to the next target on my list. It was time to deal with Chloe and the vintage pear-shaped diamond necklace she so proudly flaunted around her neck. Julian thought he could simply steal my late mother's jewelry from my private safe and hand it over to his young mistress as a shiny new toy. He assumed because we were married, he had blanket access to everything I owned. He was legally and catastrophically wrong. I drove straight from the courthouse to the Central Police Precinct in downtown Chicago. I did not go to a standard patrol officer. My career handling crisis management for the elite meant I had direct contacts in the Major Crimes Division. I walked into the bustling precinct and asked for Detective Miller, a no-nonsense investigator I had worked with on a previous corporate extortion case. He led me into his small office. I sat down across from his metal desk and pulled a thick blue folder from my briefcase. I told him I needed to officially report a grand larceny. Detective Miller opened his notepad and asked for the details. I explained that my estranged husband had illegally accessed my personal safe and stolen a highly valuable family heirloom. I slid a stack of documents across the desk to back up my claim. First, I showed him the certified appraisal papers from an exclusive jeweler dating back 10 years before I even met Julian. The documents clearly listed the diamond necklace at a staggering replacement value of $150,000. Next, I provided a certified copy of my mother's last will and testament, explicitly bequeathing the necklace solely to me as separate property. In the state of Illinois, inheritances kept entirely separate from joint accounts are not considered marital property. Julian had absolutely zero legal right to touch that necklace, let alone give it away. Detective Miller reviewed the documents carefully, nodding his head. Then he asked the most important question. He asked if I had any proof regarding the current location of the stolen property. I smiled and pulled out a stack of high-resolution glossy photographs. I handed him pictures taken by the event photographer at the charity gala just a few nights ago. In every single photo, Chloe was standing next to Julian, wearing the stolen diamonds prominently displayed against her skin. I also handed him a screenshot from a local society blog that had posted a close-up shot of her outfit from the gala. It was undeniable proof of possession of stolen property. Detective Miller closed the blue folder and leaned back in his chair. He informed me that in Illinois, possession of stolen property valued over $100,000 is a Class 1 felony. He asked me if I knew where the suspect could be located today. I told him I did not know her exact daily schedule, but I had something much better. Julian was arrogant and careless. When he froze my bank accounts, he also took the secondary emergency corporate credit card attached to my business account. He had handed that card directly to Chloe to fund her lavish lifestyle while my actual business funds were locked in court. Sarah, my forensic accountant, had been actively monitoring the transaction pings on that specific card all morning. I pulled out my phone and checked the secure banking application. I watched the screen refresh and a brand new pending transaction popped up immediately. Chloe had just swiped the card for $8,000 at an exclusive designer boutique on the Magnificent Mile. I showed the live location ping to Detective Miller. He grabbed his radio badge and jacket, standing up from his desk immediately. He told me he was taking two plainclothes officers with him to recover the stolen merchandise and make the arrest. Across town, inside the brightly lit marble interior of the luxury boutique, Chloe was living her absolute best life. She was sipping complimentary champagne while a dedicated sales associate wrapped up a stack of expensive designer handbags. She handed over the corporate credit card with a smug, satisfied smile, completely oblivious to the trap closing in around her. She was happily planning her new wealthy future with a man who had lied to her about everything. She took another sip of champagne, just as the heavy glass doors of the boutique swung open, and three serious-looking police officers stepped directly onto the pristine showroom floor. The three police officers walked with absolute purpose past the bright displays of silk scarves and expensive leather handbags, stopping directly in front of Chloe. Detective Miller held up his gold shield. Chloe lowered her champagne flute, looking more severely annoyed than actually frightened. She clearly thought she was completely untouchable in this high-end environment. She let out a dramatic sigh and asked if there was some sort of problem. Detective Miller kept his voice perfectly level and professional. He stated her full name and informed her that she was currently in possession of a stolen diamond necklace. He politely asked her to place her champagne glass on the counter, unclip the jewelry, and hand it over immediately. Chloe scoffed, rolling her eyes as if the officer had just insulted her. She loudly declared that the necklace was a romantic gift from her very wealthy boyfriend, and there was absolutely no way it was stolen. She crossed her arms defensively, demanding that the officers leave her alone before she made a few phone calls and had them all fired. Detective Miller did not flinch at her empty threats. He calmly pulled the printed photograph of the necklace and the certified appraisal document from his jacket pocket, placing them directly on the glass display case. He explained that the item around her neck was legally registered to my name and was valued at $150,000. He warned her that refusing to surrender stolen property of that massive value was a severe felony offense. Chloe looked at the paperwork, and her face flushed with bright red anger. Instead of complying, she took a step backward, gripping the diamond pendant tightly with her manicured hand. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, asking the officers if they had any idea who her boyfriend was. She yelled Julian's name and his corporate title, expecting the entire room to bow down in fear. She completely lost her temper, throwing her champagne glass onto the pristine marble floor where it shattered loudly. That violent action was the final straw. Detective Miller signaled the two plainclothes officers, who immediately stepped forward and grabbed both of her arms. Chloe shrieked in absolute panic as they forced her hands behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed through the silent boutique. The wealthy shoppers and the boutique staff stood completely frozen in shock, watching the elegant facade of the young mistress crumble into pieces. But they were not just watching. Almost every single customer in the high-end store had pulled out their smartphones and was actively recording the massive public meltdown. Chloe thrashed against the officers, screaming profanities and crying hysterically as they marched her right through the center of the showroom. The dedicated sales associate quietly reached across the counter and snatched Julian's corporate credit card back, hiding it out of sight. Chloe's humiliation was absolute and highly digitized. By the time they shoved her into the back of the waiting police cruiser, the video of her arrest was already spreading rapidly across social media networks. An hour later, Chloe was sitting inside a bleak holding cell at the downtown precinct. Her designer dress was wrinkled and her makeup was completely ruined from crying. The officers finally allowed her one phone call. She practically ripped the heavy plastic receiver off the brick wall and aggressively dialed Julian's private cell phone number. When he answered, she immediately began sobbing, demanding that he bring his lawyers down to the station to post her bail and fix this misunderstanding. She expected him to be outraged on her behalf. She expected him to ride in like a brave knight and rescue her from the terrible nightmare. But Julian did not sound angry at the police. He sounded absolutely terrified. Julian frantically asked her exactly what she had told the homicide and robbery detectives. He aggressively demanded to know if she had mentioned his various corporate bank accounts. Chloe was completely stunned by his extremely cold and incredibly selfish verbal reaction. She cried, asking why that mattered, and desperately begged him to come get her out of the filthy jail cell. Julian took a shaky breath and delivered a brutal dose of reality. He told her that he could not associate his name with a felony grand larceny investigation. He explained that paying a massive bail bond would instantly trigger a forensic audit of his finances by the authorities. He could not risk exposing his hidden millions just to save her today. He abruptly hung up the phone, leaving Chloe listening to the dead dial tone. As she sat alone in the cold concrete cell, the terrifying truth finally washed over her. She was entirely and completely disposable to him forever. 2 days later, the final divorce hearing officially arrived. The oak doors swung open, and I walked in with Elias. The gallery was unusually full for a Friday morning. The high-profile nature of our corporate case, combined with the spectacular public arrest of Julian's mistress, had attracted several curious reporters. I took my seat at the defense table, smoothing down the fabric of my tailored navy suit. I felt a profound sense of absolute clarity. The suffocating fear was completely gone. I was sitting in the calm, quiet eye of the hurricane, simply waiting for the winds to shift. A few minutes later, Julian strolled into the courtroom. He did not look like a man whose mistress was currently sitting in a cold jail cell, facing severe felony charges. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. Wearing a brand-new custom-tailored charcoal gray suit, he walked with an arrogant swagger, completely ignoring my presence. He was practically vibrating with smug, untouchable satisfaction. In his narcissistic mind, he had already executed the perfect financial crime. He successfully froze my business accounts, publicly humiliated me, driven away my manipulative family, and legally locked his hidden millions far out of my reach. The signed waiver from the parking garage was tucked safely inside his lawyer's leather briefcase, acting as his ultimate impenetrable shield. The Honorable Judge Harrison entered from his private chambers and struck his wooden gavel, commanding everyone to remain silent. He adjusted his reading glasses, looking down at the massive pile of legal paperwork covering his bench. "We are here today to officially finalize the dissolution of marriage between Julian and Jada," he announced, his deep voice echoing loudly. "I have thoroughly reviewed the preliminary financial filings. Are the legal representatives prepared to present their final settlement terms?" Julian's lawyer immediately stood up with a highly confident flourish. "Yes, Your Honor, we are fully prepared today." Julian's lawyer confidently approached the center of the room. He spoke with a booming, authoritative voice, clearly performing for the crowded gallery behind him. "Your Honor, my client has endured a highly stressful separation process. He simply wants to move on with his professional life. We have submitted the original notarized post-nuptial agreement into evidence. Furthermore, we have also submitted a signed and notarized waiver of financial discovery executed willingly by the respondent just last week. This legal waiver effectively concludes any further investigation into my client's personal banking or corporate financial portfolios." The lawyer paused, letting his heavy words sink into the silent room before delivering his final aggressive demand. "Therefore, based on the binding agreement, my client is requesting immediate possession of the suburban marital home. We are also formally requesting that 80% ownership of the lucrative public relations firm be immediately transferred to Julian as fair compensation for his initial financial investments. Once these terms are officially decreed, we ask that you finalize the divorce immediately." Julian leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his legs casually. He looked directly across the aisle at me with a sickeningly triumphant smile. He truly believed he was just minutes away from walking out a wealthy, single man, leaving me destitute. The judge nodded slowly, carefully reviewing the final documents placed directly in front of him. He looked over the top of his glasses at our defense table, his facial expression completely unreadable. "Does the defense have any final objections before I make my official ruling on these proposed settlement terms?" he asked the room. I did not move a single muscle in my chair. I just looked calmly at Elias, who was casually writing a quick note on his yellow legal pad. Elias slowly placed his silver pen down. He stood up, pushing his heavy chair back with a loud scraping sound. He buttoned his suit jacket and stepped forward into the center aisle. Your Honor, we are fully prepared to officially conclude this divorce today. Elias began, his voice perfectly calm and carefully measured. We actually have no immediate objections to the waiver of financial discovery that my client signed last week. We are not asking the court to investigate Julian's current bank accounts or his vast corporate stock portfolios. Julian's lawyer let out a quiet, arrogant scoff of victory, entirely assuming we had completely surrendered the fight. Julian smirked openly and quickly adjusted his expensive blue silk tie. However, Elias continued, raising his right index finger slightly in the air. Before we officially sign over the firm or finalize this binding legal decree, we just have one minor procedural detail regarding the marital assets to clarify. We simply need Julian to take the witness stand one final time today and clearly answer a single direct procedural question under the strict penalty of perjury. Julian's lawyer immediately objected to the request. He stood up, waving his hands aggressively, and arguing that his client had already signed the discovery waiver and had already provided extensive testimony. He claimed this was just another desperate attempt by the defense to delay the inevitable settlement. Judge Harrison, however, was a man who valued absolute clarity in his courtroom. He looked down at Julian's lawyer and calmly stated that answering just one final procedural question would not derail the proceedings. He overruled the objection and firmly instructed Julian to take the witness stand, reminding him that he was still under oath. Julian let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling his eyes, as if he were simply indulging a petulant child. He stood up, smoothed the front of his custom suit jacket, and walked confidently up to the wooden witness box. He sat down, crossing one leg over the other, and leaned back comfortably. He did not look worried in the slightest. He looked directly at me with a condescending smirk, fully believing that the piece of paper I signed in the dark parking garage made him legally invincible. He thought Elias was just going to ask a pathetic question about some minor shared bank account or a piece of forgotten furniture. Elias approached the stand, walking slowly with his hands casually resting in his pockets. He took his time, deliberately letting the heavy silence build inside the packed courtroom. He did not carry a single piece of paper or a file folder to the podium. He did not need any physical notes to execute this final maneuver. He just looked at Julian with a mild, almost polite expression, while the entire crowded room watched them both incredibly closely. Mr. Julian Elias began, his voice echoing clearly across the silent courtroom. For the official record, and to ensure the absolute integrity of this final divorce decree, I need to ask you a very specific question regarding your personal and corporate finances. Are you fully aware that lying to this court constitutes felony perjury, which carries a mandatory prison sentence? Julian chuckled softly, adjusting his expensive watch. Yes, counselor. I am fully aware of the law, he replied, his tone dripping with absolute arrogance. He crossed his arms tightly across his chest, exuding an aura of complete and utter superiority over everyone else present in the room today. Elias stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the witness box. Excellent, Elias said, nodding slightly. Then please tell this court right now, to your knowledge, are there any hidden financial assets, offshore bank accounts, shell corporations, or private trusts that have not been formally disclosed to this court during these divorce proceedings? Julian did not even hesitate. He looked right at Judge Harrison and spoke with perfect, practiced sincerity. Absolutely not, Your Honor. I have provided complete and total transparency regarding my entire financial portfolio. Everything I own is clearly listed in the documents currently sitting on your desk. Elias let the silence hang in the air for a few seconds, allowing Julian's lie to permanently settle into the official court transcript. The heavy tension in the room was palpable as every single reporter leaned forward in their gallery seats, anticipating the next move. Then Elias took one step closer, leaning slightly against the wooden rail of the witness box. Let us be incredibly specific then, Elias said, his voice dropping slightly, but remaining sharp as a razor. Do you have any personal or professional affiliation whatsoever with a corporate entity registered in the Cayman Islands, operating under the name CJ Holdings? The mention of the secret offshore shell company caused a brief microscopic flinch in Julian's confident posture. His eyes darted toward his lawyer for a fraction of a second, but he quickly regained his composure. He remembered the waiver of financial discovery. He remembered that my company tax identification number was the one tied to the account. In his twisted, narcissistic logic, he believed that denying ownership was technically safe, because he had deliberately structured the trust to look like it belonged to my public relations firm. He firmly believed the court would never be able to pierce the corporate veil he had so carefully constructed. He thought he was outsmarting Elias. He thought he was outsmarting the judge. He thought he had completely outsmarted me and secured his massive hidden fortune forever. Julian turned his head slowly and looked right into my eyes. His lips curled into a nasty, victorious smile. He raised his chin proudly and delivered the exact words we had been waiting to hear. No, he stated, his voice ringing loud and clear for the court reporter to permanently document. I swear, under oath, I do not own a single penny of CJ Holdings. Elias turned to Judge Harrison and smiled. Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Julian, he said, his voice laced with dangerous politeness. Elias stepped away from the wooden witness box and walked calmly back to our defense table. He reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila envelope provided by Sarah, our forensic accountant. He unclasped the envelope and pulled out 3 stacks of paperwork. He handed 2 stacks to the bailiff, instructing him to deliver 1 copy to the judge and another to Julian's lawyer. Your Honor, Elias announced, projecting his voice so every single reporter in the gallery could hear him clearly. The court is looking at certified financial documents officially subpoenaed from the Internal Revenue Service and the Cayman Islands Corporate Registry. These documents comprehensively detail the exact origin and the current financial holdings of the offshore shell company known as CJ Holdings. Julian's lawyer frantically flipped through the stack of papers. The color drained rapidly from his face as his eyes darted across the certified banking seals and the numerical figures. Julian sat frozen in the witness box, his confident smirk entirely replaced by an expression of pure terror. He gripped the wooden railing of the witness stand so tightly his knuckles turned white. He realized in real time that his massive ego had just driven him straight off a legal cliff. Elias continued pacing slowly in front of the judge's heavy wooden bench. As you can clearly see on page 4 of that packet, CJ Holdings was officially incorporated exactly 3 weeks ago. During that exact same week, the plaintiff secretly took out a $2 million cash loan against the marital home and wired those funds out of the country. But our forensic audit did not stop there, Your Honor. Our investigation uncovered a much larger and far more sinister financial conspiracy masterminded entirely by the man sitting on the stand today. Judge Harrison adjusted his reading glasses, scanning the documents with intense focus. He looked up, frowning deeply. Counselor, these bank statements show a total current balance of exactly $8 million. If $2 million came from the marital home equity, where exactly did the other $6 million come from? The entire courtroom collectively gasped. A low, excited murmur swept through the crowded gallery of reporters. Julian looked like he was going to be physically sick right there on the stand. He looked desperately at his lawyer, but his lawyer just stared back at him in absolute shock, finally realizing his client had lied to him about everything. Elias stopped pacing and pointed directly at Julian. That is an excellent question, Your Honor, Elias stated loudly. According to the encrypted wire transfer records detailed on page 9, that additional $6 million was systematically siphoned directly from the corporate reserve accounts of Julian's own employer. He severely abused his executive position as a senior vice president to embezzle massive amounts of capital from his prestigious investment firm and funnel it directly into this supposedly untouchable offshore fortress. He intended to let his innocent wife take the fall for his massive debts while he walked away a very rich man. Julian's lawyer found his voice and jumped to his feet, knocking his chair backward. "Objection, Your Honor!" he shouted frantically, waving his hands around. "This is an outrageous and entirely baseless accusation. My client just testified under oath that he has absolutely no connection to this foreign entity. You cannot arbitrarily pin this offshore account on him simply because of a few circumstantial wire transfers." Elias turned toward the opposing counsel and delivered a smile that was absolutely lethal. "You are entirely correct, counselor." Elias agreed smoothly, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Your client did just swear under oath in front of a federal judge and a room full of witnesses that he does not own a single penny of CJ Holdings. We firmly believe his testimony. In fact, we are completely counting on his sworn testimony today." Elias turned back to face Judge Harrison, resting his hands firmly on the polished wooden podium. "Your Honor," Elias said, his voice ringing with finality, "the international incorporation documents for CJ Holdings clearly show that the offshore account was legally registered using the federal employer identification number of my client's public relations firm. Julian illegally used her corporate tax identity to open the account, believing it would shield him from discovery. But since Mr. Julian just swore under oath that he does not own this account, and since the account is officially registered under my client's corporate tax identification number, we ask the court to make a formal ruling today. We ask the court to recognize this entire $8 million as Jada's sole and separate property." Julian's lawyer erupted into an absolute frenzy of panicked objections. He threw his hands into the air and practically shouted that the documents had to be fabricated, and that his client was being maliciously framed by a vengeful spouse. He desperately argued that the court could not possibly accept these financial records without a massive and lengthy independent investigation. He was grasping at thin air, entirely aware that the certified seals from the Internal Revenue Service and the International Banking Registry were completely undeniable. Judge Harrison slammed his wooden gavel down with such tremendous force that the sharp cracking sound made the entire courtroom jump. He ordered the frantic lawyer to sit down immediately and remain completely silent while he reviewed the submitted evidence. The lawyer slowly sank back into his heavy chair, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. He refused to even look at Julian. He knew his legal career was now dangerously close to being dragged down into the mud alongside his deceitful client. The courtroom descended into a thick, suffocating silence. The only sound echoing in the large room was the crisp rustling of heavy paper as Judge Harrison meticulously turned the pages of the financial audit. He read through the offshore incorporation documents, verifying the corporate tax identification numbers and cross-referencing them with the records Elias had provided. He examined the complex web of wire transfers linking the embezzled corporate funds directly to the hidden Cayman Islands account. As the judge read, his facial expression transformed from judicial neutrality into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The veins in his neck visibly bulged against his white collar. He realized that the man sitting in his witness box had not just lied about a secret bank account. Julian had orchestrated a massive, calculated criminal enterprise right under the nose of the federal court. He had actively forged his wife's signature on a fake post-nuptial agreement to illegally freeze her legitimate business accounts. He had maliciously bribed a family member to provide false testimony and commit perjury to destroy her character. And just minutes ago, he had looked a federal judge dead in the eye and blatantly lied under oath with a sickeningly arrogant smile on his face. Judge Harrison finally dropped the thick stack of papers onto his desk. He took off his reading glasses and glared down at Julian with a look of absolute disgust. The arrogant facade Julian had worn for months completely melted away, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic shell of a man. "Mr. Julian," the judge began, his deep voice practically shaking with righteous anger. "I have presided over this family court for more than 20 years. I have seen bitter spouses hide money. I have seen petty arguments over property. But I have never, in my entire judicial career, witnessed such a breathtaking display of sheer malicious fraud and absolute disrespect for the law. You came into my courtroom wearing a custom suit and a condescending smile, believing you were the smartest person in the room. You believed you could weaponize the legal system to entirely destroy your wife while secretly hoarding millions of stolen dollars. Julian opened his mouth, attempting to stutter out a pathetic excuse, but the judge instantly cut him off. "Do not speak," the judge roared, leaning over his heavy wooden bench. "You gave up your right to speak when you decided to commit blatant felony perjury in my courtroom. You forged legal documents. You bribed a witness to taint the integrity of these proceedings. You embezzled millions from your own employer and attempted to use your wife's business as a criminal shield. You thought you had orchestrated the perfect crime, but instead you have handed this court the exact rope needed to hang you." The reporters in the gallery furiously scribbled notes, captivated by the explosive judicial thrashing. Julian shrank into the wooden witness chair, cowering under the immense weight of the judge's fury. He was entirely trapped. No clever public relations spin, and no expensive lawyer could save him from the irrefutable paper trail staring him right in the face. Judge Harrison took a deep, steadying breath and picked up his heavy wooden gavel once more. His piercing eyes tightly locked onto Julian's pathetic and trembling form. In the state of Illinois, when a spouse deliberately and maliciously attempts to hide significant marital assets from the court, we do not simply divide the hidden money evenly. We apply a very specific and highly punitive legal principle. It is officially called the legal doctrine of fraudulent concealment. And under this exact and precise legal doctrine, when a spouse is caught intentionally concealing assets with the malicious intent to defraud, they completely and permanently forfeit their right to those assets entirely. Judge Harrison paused, letting the absolute finality of his words settle over the courtroom. He looked down at the documents one last time before delivering the most devastating ruling I had ever witnessed. Therefore, based on the undeniable evidence of extreme financial fraud and blatant perjury presented today, I am officially voiding the forged post-nuptial agreement entirely. I am also completely voiding the waiver of financial discovery, as it was signed under deeply fraudulent pretenses. The judge shifted his piercing gaze directly to Julian, who was now visibly shaking in the witness box. "I hereby award the respondent, Jada, 100% exclusive ownership of her public relations firm. The plaintiff will immediately relinquish any and all claims to the commercial lease and all associated business assets. Furthermore, I am awarding Jada sole and immediate possession of the suburban marital home. You are ordered to vacate the premises completely by 5 o'clock this evening. Any personal belongings left behind will be legally considered abandoned property." Julian's lawyer lowered his head into his hands, knowing his arrogant client was being absolutely financially slaughtered. But Judge Harrison was not finished dispensing his justice. The judge picked up the certified offshore banking records and held them high in the air for the entire gallery to see. Regarding the hidden Cayman Islands account operating under the name CJ Holdings, the court officially recognizes that the plaintiff intentionally and maliciously attempted to conceal these massive assets to completely defraud his wife. Because he illegally utilized her corporate tax identification number and subsequently swore under oath that he had no ownership of this account, I am applying the doctrine of fraudulent concealment to its absolute fullest extent. I hereby award 100% of the $8 million balance currently held in CJ Holdings to Jada as her sole and separate property. You will not receive a single penny of those offshore funds. A collective gasp rippled rapidly through the gallery. I sat perfectly still at the heavy defense table, feeling a massive wave of absolute vindication wash over my entire body. Elias gave me a nod of deep professional respect. Julian stared at the judge, his mouth hanging open in pure, unadulterated disbelief. His entire hidden empire, the millions he had stolen and meticulously hidden away, had just been legally handed directly to the woman he spent months trying to destroy. To finalize this binding decree, Judge Harrison added, his voice ringing with absolute unwavering authority. Given the highly egregious nature of the plaintiff's actions and the massive waste of judicial resources caused by his orchestrated perjury, I am ordering Julian to pay 100% of the respondent's legal fees. This family court is officially adjourned. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. For a split second, the courtroom was completely silent. Then Julian entirely snapped. The pristine corporate executive facade he had spent his entire life building shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He leaped out of the wooden witness chair, his face twisted into a terrifying mask of pure rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the judge and began screaming at the top of his lungs. "You cannot do this to me!" Julian roared, his voice echoing violently off the high vaulted ceilings. "That is my money. I earned every single dollar of that money. You have absolutely no right to take it away and give it to her. She is nothing without me." The two armed bailiffs standing near the heavy oak doors immediately placed their hands on their holsters and began jogging down the center aisle toward the witness box. Julian's lawyer frantically jumped up, grabbing Julian's arm and desperately trying to pull him back, but Julian violently shoved him away. He turned his furious gaze toward me, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. "You set me up, you manipulative witch!" he screamed, spitting the words out with venomous hatred. "I will completely destroy you. I will drag you through the mud until you have absolutely nothing left." Judge Harrison stood up, towering over his massive wooden bench. His face was flushed with intense judicial fury at the blatant disrespect in his courtroom. "Bailiffs, restrain him immediately," the judge commanded loudly over Julian's psychotic screaming. Julian continued to thrash wildly, knocking a heavy wooden chair backward onto the polished marble floor. He screamed that he was a senior vice president and that the court had no idea who they were dealing with. Judge Harrison picked up his gavel and slammed it down repeatedly, furiously demanding order. "Mr. Julian, you are completely out of line," the judge bellowed, his voice easily overpowering Julian's frantic screams. "I am officially holding you in direct criminal contempt of court." Two heavily armed bailiffs immediately descended upon the witness box, grabbing Julian by both of his arms. He struggled wildly against their tight grip, but they swiftly forced his hands behind his back and secured them with heavy steel handcuffs. The cold metallic click echoed through the room, silencing his frantic screams. Judge Harrison stared down at him with unwavering authority, ordering the officers to remove him from the premises and place him in a holding cell for the entire weekend. Julian was practically dragged down the center aisle of the courtroom, his expensive custom suit rumpled and his face flushed with panicked sweat. He looked back at me one final time, but I simply sat at the defense table, returning his gaze with absolute cold indifference. As the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind him, the packed gallery erupted into excited whispers. Elias calmly gathered our legal documents, slipping them back into his worn leather briefcase. He turned to me with a rare, genuine smile and congratulated me on reclaiming my entire life. I walked out of that magnificent courthouse feeling significantly lighter than I had in several years, but the absolute and total destruction of Julian's wealthy world was only just beginning. The certified financial documents Elias had submitted to the judge were now a matter of public court record. Because Julian had brazenly stolen $6 million from his own employer, the court was legally obligated to immediately notify the corporate compliance officers at his prestigious investment fund. The news hit the massive Chicago financial firm like a devastating earthquake. By early Monday morning, while Julian was still sitting in a miserable concrete holding cell, waiting to be processed, the board of directors convened a mandatory emergency executive meeting. The chief executive officer and the senior partners meticulously reviewed the undeniable forensic evidence provided by the federal court. They saw exactly how Julian had severely abused his executive clearance to systematically siphon millions of dollars from their highly secure corporate reserve accounts into his hidden offshore trust. They were absolutely and completely furious about it. Julian had not just stolen their money, he had completely compromised the pristine integrity of their entire financial institution. He had put their wealthy investors at massive risk and humiliated the firm on a highly public stage. The board of directors did not hesitate for a single second. They instantly drafted an official termination letter stripping Julian of his vice president title, his lucrative executive privileges, and his massive corporate pension. But simply firing him was not nearly enough to satisfy the enraged senior partners. They immediately mobilized their ruthless corporate legal team to file a massive civil lawsuit against Julian for gross embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, and severe corporate fraud. They wanted every single penny back, and they wanted him publicly ruined to protect their own brand reputation. It was a spectacular twist of profound irony. Julian had spent weeks actively trying to destroy my public relations firm by spreading vicious rumors of federal embezzlement to my top clients. Now he was the one making front-page headlines in the financial news, actually guilty of the exact horrific crimes he had maliciously accused me of committing. My phone was already ringing with calls from journalists wanting a statement, but I chose to remain perfectly silent, letting his own actions speak for themselves. When Julian was finally released from the county holding cell late Monday afternoon, he stepped out onto the busy downtown sidewalk a completely broken man. His high-priced lawyer had officially dropped him as a client, refusing to represent a man who had lied to him and committed felony perjury in open federal court. Julian reached into his pocket and turned on his cell phone, only to find dozens of angry voicemails from his former bosses and a harsh email containing his immediate termination notice. He tried to call a private car service to take him away from the courthouse, but his corporate credit cards were entirely deactivated. He tried to access his personal checking account, but the financial regulators had completely frozen all of his domestic assets, pending a massive criminal investigation. His hidden offshore millions, the massive fortune he had lied and cheated to secure, were legally awarded entirely to me. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. He stood completely alone on the cold concrete pavement, staring blankly at the towering city skyline that he used to believe he owned. The arrogant corporate executive who thought he could effortlessly crush his wife and steal her livelihood was now completely penniless. He was officially jobless, and he was staring down the barrel of severe federal criminal charges. His entire carefully constructed life had completely evaporated into thin air, leaving him with absolutely no escape route. But if Julian thought losing his corporate job and his stolen fortune was the absolute rock bottom of his existence, he was severely underestimating the sheer destructive power of a scorned crisis public relations manager. While he spent the weekend rotting inside that cold concrete holding cell, I was operating from the comfort of my beautifully restored downtown office. I had officially regained legal control of my company headquarters early Saturday morning. I sat at my mahogany desk and meticulously executed the final phase of my strategy. I did not just want Julian to be privately punished. I wanted his absolute downfall to become a highly publicized spectacle. I utilized my media contacts to anonymously leak the certified court transcripts and the financial audit directly to every major news outlet in the city. I painted a compelling narrative of a corrupt executive stealing from his own investors to fund a secret offshore empire. The hungry financial press devoured the incredibly scandalous story without a single ounce of hesitation. As Julian stood frozen on the wide concrete steps of the downtown courthouse, clutching his deactivated cell phone, he suddenly heard the loud squealing of tires. A massive fleet of brightly colored news vans from 3 different major television networks abruptly pulled up to the curb. Dozens of aggressive reporters and determined camera operators flooded out of the vehicles, rushing directly toward him. Bright camera flashes exploded in his face, blinding him in the late afternoon sun. Reporters began shouting overlapping questions, demanding to know exactly how much money he had embezzled from his wealthy clients. They asked him about his fired mistress and his frozen Cayman Islands account. Julian stumbled backward, holding his briefcase up to shield his face, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He had spent his entire career carefully cultivating a pristine image of corporate superiority, and now it was being brutally torn apart on live television. He desperately tried to physically push his way through the overwhelming crowd of journalists frantically looking for any safe place to hide, But the aggressive reporters completely surrounded him, trapping him perfectly on the courthouse steps. Before Julian could even attempt to answer a single question, a loud piercing siren cut through the chaotic noise of the press corps. Three heavy black government vehicles aggressively pulled up directly behind the news vans. The heavy doors swung open, and six serious-looking federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the Federal Bureau logo printed clearly on the back stepped out onto the busy pavement. The crowd of journalists immediately parted like the Red Sea, allowing the federal agents a clear and direct path straight to the disgraced executive. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern expression, marched directly up to Julian and firmly grabbed him by the shoulder. Julian physically flinched, trying to violently pull away, but the agent held him in a tight iron grip. The federal agent spoke with a loud, booming voice, ensuring that every single television camera microphone captured the historic moment perfectly. He stated Julian's full legal name and announced that he was officially under federal arrest. He listed the severe criminal charges rapidly, including massive wire fraud, international money laundering, criminal conspiracy, and felony perjury. Julian let out a truly pathetic whimpering sound, his weak legs practically giving out completely beneath him as the heavy reality of his dire situation finally crushed his arrogant spirit entirely. The agent forcefully spun Julian around, pushing him against the cold stone pillar of the courthouse building. For the second time in less than 4 days, heavy steel handcuffs were tightly clamped around Julian's wrists. The loud metallic clicking sound was captured flawlessly by the local news cameras, broadcasting his total humiliation to millions of viewers across the entire country. I stood quietly near the corner of the street, leaning against the polished hood of my sedan, watching the masterpiece unfold with absolute satisfaction. Julian was violently shoved forward by the agents, forced to do the humiliating perp walk right past the flashing cameras and screaming reporters. As they dragged him toward the waiting government vehicle, he frantically looked around the crowded street. His desperate eyes suddenly locked onto mine. He stopped struggling for a brief second, his face pale and completely covered in sweat. "Jada," he screamed, his voice cracking with raw, pathetic desperation. "Please help me, Jada. I am so sorry. I will fix this. Just please help me." He begged like a terrified child, expecting me to somehow save him from the devastating consequences of his own malicious actions. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not smile. I simply raised my hands gracefully, adjusted my dark designer sunglasses to block out the flashing camera lights, turned my back on him, and walked away. While Julian was being formally processed by federal agents, the collateral damage of his massive ego was finally facing her own brutal reality across town. Chloe had just been released on bond after her parents were forced to drain their retirement savings to temporarily secure her freedom. She walked out of the downtown precinct wearing the exact same wrinkled designer dress she had been arrested in days earlier. Her face was pale, and her confidence was completely shattered, but she still clung to a pathetic sliver of delusional hope. She genuinely believed that Julian's massive wealth and corporate influence could somehow miraculously rescue them both from this nightmare. She thought his temporary silence was just part of a brilliant legal strategy. She stood on the cold, concrete sidewalk, shivering in the wind, and furiously dialed his private phone number over and over again, but every single call went straight to a disconnected automated message. Desperate for answers and terrified of her looming felony grand larceny charge, she hailed a cab and directed the driver to the federal courthouse, where she knew his divorce hearing was taking place. Chloe arrived just as the massive media circus was beginning to disperse from the courthouse steps. She pushed her way through the lingering reporters, frantically searching the perimeter, until she spotted Julian. He was not walking out as a victorious, wealthy executive. He was being aggressively escorted toward a secure transport van by 2 federal marshals. Chloe sprinted across the pavement, screaming his name and waving her hands wildly. Julian looked up through the heavy metal grate of the transport vehicle. His face was bruised with exhaustion and his eyes were completely hollow. Chloe demanded to know where his lawyers were and begged him to wire the money to cover her expensive legal fees. She cried hysterically, reminding him that she had ruined her entire life for him. Julian pressed his face against the cold metal mesh and laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made her physically recoil. He did not offer her any comfort or false promises. He looked at the young woman he had manipulated and coldly informed her that he was bankrupt. He told her that his firm had fired him, that the federal government was seizing everything, and that the millions of dollars they were supposed to share now legally belonged to me. The devastating reality hit Chloe with the crushing force of a freight train. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the uneven pavement, causing her to fall hard onto her knees. Right there in the middle of the crowded downtown street, Chloe suffered a complete and total psychological breakdown. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, pulling frantically at her tangled hair and sobbing uncontrollably. The lingering journalists immediately turned their cameras toward the chaotic scene, capturing every single pathetic second of her public meltdown. Chloe suddenly realized the terrifying magnitude of her foolish choices. She had eagerly sacrificed her youth, her college education, and her promising corporate internship for a deceitful criminal who viewed her as nothing more than a temporary accessory. She had willingly destroyed another woman's marriage for a man who left her with absolutely nothing but a permanently ruined reputation, massive legal debt, and a severe felony conviction hanging over her head for the rest of her life. She was completely, utterly, and permanently ruined. While Chloe wailed on the cold concrete and Julian was transported to a maximum security federal prison, I was sitting comfortably behind my polished mahogany desk drinking a cup of premium green tea. The phone lines at my public relations firm were ringing non-stop, but instead of clients calling to cancel their contracts, they were calling to beg for my services. My masterful handling of my own high-profile crisis had essentially become the greatest marketing campaign in the history of my company. Suddenly, my private office line flashed with an incoming call from Los Angeles. I answered the phone, keeping my voice perfectly professional. The man on the other end introduced himself as a senior executive producer from a massive streaming network. He had seen the viral footage of the courthouse arrest and the boutique meltdown. He told me the network wanted to immediately greenlight a multi-part reality television documentary chronicling the spectacular rise and fall of my disgraced husband. He offered me a highly lucrative contract to purchase the exclusive rights to my story. I took a slow sip of my tea and smiled. I told the producer I would gladly sign the rights over on one very specific non-negotiable condition. I demanded the official title of executive producer, ensuring I retained total creative control over exactly how Julian's pathetic legacy would be broadcast to the entire world. Securing that lucrative television deal was the absolute perfect conclusion to my chaotic legal battle and the ultimate final nail in the coffin of his public reputation. 6 months passed since that phone call, and my life transformed into something more magnificent than I ever could have imagined. The streaming network released the documentary series, and it became an instant international sensation. Millions of people watched the meticulous breakdown of Julian's arrogance and my calculated retaliation. As a direct result of that flawless public relations execution, my corporate firm did not just survive the scandal, it absolutely thrived. My annual revenue completely tripled within a matter of months. Every major celebrity and elite executive in the country wanted to hire the woman who had masterfully dismantled a corrupt financial empire from her cell phone. I moved my company into a massive new corner office suite overlooking the Chicago River, outfitting it with heavy glass doors and state-of-the-art security systems that Julian could never dream of breaching. I was no longer just managing crises for the wealthy elite. I had become an absolute titan in my own industry, completely untouchable and highly respected. The profound success of my business was only one piece of my reclaimed life. I also moved back into the beautiful suburban marital home that Julian had so desperately tried to steal from me. The moment I stepped back through the front doors, I hired a team of luxury interior designers to completely erase every single trace of his existence from the property. The dark, heavy furniture he preferred was entirely thrown out and replaced with bright, elegant pieces that brought warmth and light into the massive house. I turned his former home office into a gorgeous personal library filled with my favorite books and fresh flowers. Walking through the spacious hallways no longer felt like navigating a cold, silent prison. The house was finally a true sanctuary, echoing only with my own footsteps and the peaceful sounds of my brand new life. I threw lavish dinner parties for my loyal friends and celebrated my hard-won freedom in the very same dining room where Julian once thought he could legally strip away my entire future. But the most rewarding part of my restoration was repairing the broken foundation of my own family. Derek had stayed true to his word at the courthouse. He finalized his incredibly messy divorce from Ashley, completely cutting her toxic presence out of his life forever. Without the marital home to leverage, and without Julian's promised bribe, Ashley was left with absolutely nothing but mounting legal bills. She was forced to move back into her parents' cramped basement in Connecticut, thoroughly humiliated and permanently exiled from our family circle. Derek spent the first few months of his newfound freedom doing a lot of deep personal reflection and actively apologizing for his past cowardice. Seeing his genuine growth and his renewed dedication to our family, I made a major executive decision. I formally hired my older brother to be the brand new chief operations officer of my rapidly expanding public relations firm. He had a brilliant mind for corporate logistics, and I needed someone I could trust implicitly to help me manage the massive influx of new high-profile clients. We were keeping the newly acquired wealth strictly inside our true family, building a generational legacy that no greedy outsider could ever infiltrate or tear apart again. It was late on a wonderfully quiet Friday afternoon, and I was sitting comfortably at the massive mahogany desk inside my pristine home library. The setting sun cast a warm golden glow across the polished hardwood floor, highlighting the serenity of my space. Suddenly, the sharp ring of my private cell phone broke the peaceful silence of the room. I picked up the sleek, black device and looked down at the bright screen. The caller identification displayed an unknown number, but the automated voice message immediately revealed the true source of the unexpected interruption. It was an official collect call originating directly from the federal penitentiary located in Marion, Illinois. The robotic operator coldly announced that an inmate named Julian was desperately attempting to reach me. I stared at his name flashing on the digital screen, feeling no pity whatsoever for his miserable situation. I vividly imagined him standing nervously at a dirty metal payphone in a crowded, dangerous prison yard, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, stripped of his arrogant executive pride. He was undoubtedly surrounded by hardened criminals, desperately hoping I would finally answer the phone and somehow show him a tiny fraction of the mercy he never once showed me. A slow, highly satisfied smile spread across my face as I firmly pressed the red button to decline the call forever. I tossed the phone casually onto the polished mahogany desk and walked out of the library, leaving his desperate existence far behind me. The rich, comforting aroma of roasted chicken and slow-baked macaroni and cheese drifted through the wide, brightly lit hallways of my home. It was Sunday evening, and I was officially hosting our traditional family dinner. But unlike that miserable, suffocating evening months ago, this dinner was not steeped in toxic manipulation or conditional love. This gathering was a true celebration of survival and fierce, unwavering loyalty. Classical jazz music played softly from the hidden ceiling speakers, replacing the tense, silent atmosphere that used to haunt this house. The heavy brass doorbell rang, and I opened the front door to find my mother and Derek standing on the porch. My mother was holding a massive homemade peach cobbler still warm from her oven. Derek's face was noticeably brighter than I had seen it in years. The heavy dark circles under his eyes, caused by Ashley's constant financial demands, were completely gone. His posture was relaxed, and his smile was entirely genuine. He walked into the grand foyer and pulled me into a tight, loving hug. My mother kissed my cheek, her eyes shining with absolute pride as she looked around the beautifully renovated space. She told me the house finally felt like a real home again. We gathered around the massive oak dining table in the center of the room. There was no arrogant corporate executive sitting at the head of the table making cruel, condescending remarks about our background. There was no bitter, entitled sister-in-law rolling her eyes and secretly calculating how to steal our peace. It was just us. We passed heavy ceramic bowls of seasoned collard greens and warm buttered cornbread, laughing loudly at old childhood memories. The oppressive weight of Julian's narcissism and Ashley's subtle racism was permanently eradicated from our lives. The air in the room felt incredibly light and completely pure. Halfway through the meal, Derek stood up, holding his crystal glass filled with iced tea. He looked at me, and our mother, his expression turning deeply sincere. He raised his glass and thanked me for saving his life and his sanity. He admitted that he had almost lost his entire identity to a woman who only valued him for his proximity to wealth and status. He toasted to our brand new corporate partnership at the public relations firm and to a beautiful future built on absolute honesty and mutual respect. We clinked our glasses together, the clear chiming sound ringing beautifully throughout the large, elegant dining room. As I sat there eating my meal and watching my family smile, I realized the profound magnitude of what I had actually accomplished. I had not just won a messy legal battle. I had fundamentally rewritten the entire trajectory of my life and secured my family's future. Julian thought he could leave me with absolutely nothing. But in his desperate, malicious attempt to ruin me, he accidentally handed me the exact tools I needed to build an untouchable empire. He gave me ultimate financial independence, he inadvertently freed my brother from a toxic marriage, and he provided my business with the greatest public relations marketing campaign money could ever buy. I took a sip of my tea, feeling a profound sense of total emotional catharsis. The deep trauma of his betrayal had been completely replaced with glorious, undeniable triumph. I thought about Ashley sitting in her parents' cramped basement, entirely stripped of the wealthy lifestyle she felt so ruthlessly entitled to. I thought about Chloe facing a severe felony conviction, realizing that trading her personal dignity for stolen diamonds only bought her a permanent criminal record. And I thought about Julian locked permanently inside a federal prison cell, stripped of his expensive suits and his corporate titles, finally understanding that his massive ego was his ultimate downfall. They had all tried to bury me under their lies, but they completely failed to realize that I was a seed ready to grow. I want you to remember this story the next time someone tries to belittle your worth or steal your hard-earned success. When someone continuously disrespects you and underestimates your intelligence, you do not need to lower yourself to their miserable level. You do not need to throw a public tantrum or beg for their validation. The best revenge isn't screaming or fighting. It's letting arrogant people talk themselves into their own graves. I let my ex-husband dig a hole so deep, he struck his own oil and handed the deed to me. The most striking lesson to extract from Jada's story is the unmatched power of emotional discipline and strategic patience when facing deep betrayal. In the heat of malicious attacks, our immediate human instinct is often to scream, fight back, and demand instant justice. However, this narrative teaches us a profound alternative. True power comes from remaining completely calm and allowing a toxic person's arrogance to become their own spectacular undoing. Narcissistic and manipulative individuals thrive on the emotional reactions of their targets. When Jada was confronted with blatant financial abuse and public humiliation, she deliberately chose not to flip the table. She recognized that their overconfidence was their most glaring vulnerability. By briefly playing the role of the defeated victim, she actively fed her ex-husband's massive ego, which completely blinded him to the legal and financial traps he was setting for himself. Arrogance inherently creates massive blind spots, and calculated patience is the best tool to exploit them. This story serves as a powerful reminder that maintaining composure in the face of sheer malice is never a sign of weakness. It is your ultimate strategic advantage. We frequently feel an overwhelming pressure to loudly defend our character the moment we are attacked. Yet Jada proves that the most devastating and effective response is to step back quietly, secure undeniable facts, and let the truth detonate when the stakes are at their absolute highest. When you are dealing with deeply manipulative people, giving them enough rope to hang themselves is infinitely more effective than fighting them head on. Their own unchecked greed will inevitably build the cage that traps them. Take a moment today to identify one conflict in your life where you can replace a heated emotional reaction with calm, calculated strategy.